There is something you did, something that at the time felt like giving up, something that felt like defeat dressed up as dignity, something that cost you more than anyone around you understood, because from the outside it looked like stillness, like calm, like someone who had simply moved on. But you know what it actually was? You know what it took? You know exactly how loud the silence was on your end. And what I need you to understand today, what I need to land in the deepest part of you where the doubt still lives, is that the silence you chose, the words you swallowed, the explanations you withheld, the reactions you refused to perform, was the most powerful thing you have done in this entire situation. Not the most obvious thing, not the most celebrated thing, the most powerful, and it is working in ways you cannot fully see yet, but they can feel every single day. Let me take you back to the moment you stopped, because I want you to understand what actually happened in that moment. Not the story you may have told yourself about it, not the version where stopping felt like losing, but the reality of what that decision set into motion. You had been communicating, explaining, defending, reaching. Maybe not all of those things at once, maybe not all of them out loud, but in some form you had been extending yourself toward this person, offering your words as a bridge, offering your honesty as an invitation, offering your vulnerability as evidence that you were real, that what existed between you was real, that you were worth the effort of being met halfway. And at some point, you stopped. Not because you stopped caring. I want to be very clear about that. You did not go quiet because you ran out of feelings. You went quiet because you finally understood something that took a long time and a lot of pain to learn. That your words, no matter how honest, no matter how carefully chosen, no matter how much of yourself you poured into them, were not going to create in this person the understanding you needed them to have. Some things cannot be explained into existence. Some realizations can only be arrived at through absence. And the moment you stopped trying to explain, you handed them exactly that. The absence, and the absence is doing what your words never could. Here is what is happening on their end right now. And I want you to really hear this, because I think part of you needs the confirmation, even if another part of you has already sensed it. They are not okay with the silence. They thought they would be. That is the thing about this kind of person. When you were present, when you were communicating, when your energy was actively directed toward them, they had the luxury of taking it for granted. The luxury of being casual about something that was not casual. The luxury of responding on their timeline, engaging on their terms, showing up at the level they felt comfortable with rather than the level the situation actually called for, because you were there. And the certainty of your presence created a kind of carelessness in them that they did not even fully recognize as carelessness while it was happening. It just felt like normal, and then normal disappeared. And they discovered something they were not prepared for, that your absence does not feel like normal at all. It feels like something missing, not in a vague, general, something is off kind of way. In a specific, located, I know exactly what this is kind of way that is significantly harder to manage than they anticipated. They thought silence from you would feel like relief. It does not feel like relief. I want to describe what their internal experience looks like right now, because I think understanding it is going to shift something for you. They check, not always consciously, not always in a way they would admit to if someone asked them directly, but they check, they look for evidence of you, they register your presence or your absence in the spaces where your presence used to live. They notice when you have not reached out. They notice the silence in places that used to carry the sound of you. And that noticing is involuntary. That is the important part. It is not something they decided to do. It is not a choice they made to pay more attention. It is their system, their nervous system, their emotional architecture doing what it does when something it had integrated as a constant suddenly becomes an absent. It searches, and every time it searches and finds nothing, the absence registers more strongly than it did before. The silence gets louder with each passing day. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual mechanics of how human psychology responds to the withdrawal of something it had taken for granted. What was invisible when it was present becomes impossible to ignore when it is gone. You are impossible to ignore right now, and you are not even in the room. Let me talk about what they are telling themselves, because there is a story running in their mind about why you went quiet, and that story is revealing in ways they do not fully realize. In the beginning, they probably told themselves it was temporary, that you needed space, that you were processing something, that the silence was a phase and not a decision. That framing was comfortable because it kept them in the position of waiting rather than reckoning. Waiting is passive. Waiting does not require anything from them. Waiting does not ask them to examine what they did or did not do that contributed to this moment. But as the silence has extended, as the days have accumulated, and the temporary has started to feel permanent, the comfortable story has become harder to maintain. And in the space where that story is losing its convincing power, questions are moving in. Questions they did not want to ask. Questions that implicate them rather than protect them. Questions like, what did I actually do here? What did I take for granted? What was I not paying attention to when I should have been? What did I have that I did not fully appreciate until it was no longer available to me? Those questions are not comfortable, and they cannot be silenced by distraction the way simpler discomforts can. They have a persistence that ordinary deflection does not address because they are true. And true questions have a way of staying until they are honestly answered. Here's something I want to say specifically to the part of you that wonders whether you made the right choice. The part that sits in the quiet moments and replays the decision to stop and feels the weight of it and asks itself whether staying silent was the right thing or whether it was just the easier thing dressed up as strength. I want to speak directly to that part. You did not go quiet because it was easy. There is nothing easy about swallowing the words you actually want to say to someone who matters to you. There is nothing easy about resisting the impulse to reach out when reaching out would take 3 seconds and the relief of it would be immediate, even if temporary. There is nothing easy about sitting with the uncertainty of not knowing how they are interpreting your silence, whether they are thinking about you, whether the distance is registering the way you hoped it would, or whether it is simply being accepted without the weight you intended. None of that is easy. What you did was not the easy thing. It was the brave thing. And the reason it was brave is because it required you to tolerate your own discomfort without immediately seeking relief from them. It required you to stop outsourcing your emotional regulation to a person who had not earned that role. It required you to trust that the discomfort of the silence was productive, even when it did not feel productive, even when it just felt like pain, with no visible purpose. That trust, that willingness to sit in the discomfort without collapsing it prematurely, is one of the hardest things a person can do. And you did it. And it is working. Let me tell you what your silence communicated that your words never could have. It communicated value, not in a strategic way, not in the calculated, I am going to be silent so they miss me way that is really just another form of chasing dressed up as withdrawing, in the real way. The way that only happens when someone genuinely stops seeking validation from a particular source and starts drawing from something internal instead. When you stopped talking, when you stopped explaining and reaching and offering yourself as something to be considered or reconsidered, you demonstrated something that no amount of articulate, heartfelt, perfectly worded communication could have demonstrated. You demonstrated that you exist fully outside of their acknowledgement of you, that your sense of yourself does not require their input to remain intact, that you are not a question waiting for them to supply the answer. That was the message, and it landed louder than anything you said before it, louder than any conversation you had, any argument you survived, any explanation you offered. The silence said what language could not, and they heard it, even if they have not said so, even if they will not say so. They heard it. Now, I want to address something that I think is sitting just beneath the surface for a lot of you. The question of what happens next, because the silence has been doing its work, and somewhere in you there is a question about what to do with that, whether to maintain it, whether to break it, whether there is a version of this where you speak again and it is different from every time you spoke before. And I want to be honest with you about this because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort. The silence is only powerful if it comes from a genuine place, if it is a strategy, a technique, a move in a game you are playing while secretly hoping they will make the next move. It will eventually collapse under the weight of that hidden agenda. Because strategies require maintenance, and maintained silences have a different energy than genuine ones. People can feel the difference even when they cannot articulate it. But if your silence comes from a real place, from a genuine reorientation of your energy away from a dynamic that was not serving you and toward yourself and your own life, then it is sustainable. And sustainable silence is the kind that changes things. The kind that when it is eventually broken, if it is broken, changes the terms of everything that follows. Because you will not be breaking it from the same place you were in before. You will be speaking, if you choose to speak, from a position of genuine groundedness, from a place that does not need a particular response in order to remain stable. And that groundedness, that unattachment to a specific outcome, changes everything about the dynamic, everything. I also want to talk about what is happening in you during the silence, because this is not only a story about them and what they are experiencing, this is equally a story about you and what is being built inside you in the quiet. Something is clarifying. In the absence of the noise of that dynamic, in the space where the back and forth used to live, something is becoming visible to you that was not visible before. Your own thoughts, uninterrupted by the constant processing of their responses and their moods and their signals, your own feelings, uncontaminated by the anxiety of monitoring how they are receiving you. Your own sense of what you actually want, distinct from the version of what you want that got shaped and reshaped by the experience of wanting it from them specifically. That clarity is not a small thing. It is actually the most valuable thing that comes out of this kind of silence, not what it does to them, what it does to you. Because the person emerging from this quiet, the version of you that has been sitting with your own thoughts long enough to actually hear them, that person knows things about themselves that the version of you who was always in communication with this person did not have access to. You know what it feels like to not need their input. You know what your own energy feels like when it is not being filtered through the dynamic of what you had with them. And what you are finding in that unfiltered space is that you are more than you remembered, more settled, more complete, more entire than you had access to when they were the constant reference point. Let me speak to the Virgo energy specifically, because there is something about the way you are wired that makes this particular lesson both harder and more profound for you than it might be for someone else. You process, that is your nature. You turn things over. You examine them from multiple angles. You look for the logic, the pattern, the thing that makes sense out of what happened. And when something does not make sense, when the pieces do not fit the way they should, you have a tendency to keep working at it, to keep trying to find the explanation that resolves the dissonance. The silence asked you to stop doing that. It asked you to sit with the unresolved, to let the thing remain without a neat explanation, to release your grip on the need for it to make sense before you could move. For someone wired the way you are wired, that is an enormous ask. And the fact that you did it, that you chose the silence over the endless processing, that you let the unanswered questions remain unanswered, rather than continuing to direct your energy toward someone who was not meeting that energy, that is growth of the deepest kind. The kind that does not show up in obvious ways, but that restructures everything quietly from the inside out. You have done that work, and you are not the same person you were when this silence began. Not even close. Here is what I want to say about their reaction to you now, because I feel it very specifically, and I think it is important that you understand the full picture. They are not just missing you in the passive, wistful sense of occasionally thinking about someone who is no longer present. It is more active than that, more restless. There is a quality of unfinished business in how they are holding this. A sense that something was left at a point that does not feel like a real ending, that the story between you reached a pause rather than a conclusion, and that the pause has extended past the point where it is comfortable to call it a pause. They are sitting with that unfinished quality, and it is not sitting lightly. It surfaces at inconvenient moments, in the middle of things that are supposed to be distracting, in the quiet before sleep, when the defenses are down and the mind goes where it actually wants to go rather than where it is directed. In the small, random, unguarded moments of an ordinary day, when something triggers a thought of you and the thought does not pass quickly the way comfortable memories pass, it lingers. It asks something. It leaves a residue that does not fully clear before the next trigger arrives. That is what your silence has created in them. Not closure. The opposite of closure. An opening that stays open. A question that stays live. And the longer the silence holds, the louder that question becomes. I want to close with something that I feel is the most important thing I could say to you today. More important than what is happening with them, more important than the mechanics of how the silence is landing, more important than any of the external dynamics we have been tracing. The silence was never really about them. I know it started there. I know the initial impulse came from the situation with them, from reaching a point where continuing to communicate felt like continuing to pour into something that was not holding what you were giving it. I know the silence was, at least in part, a response to them. But what it became, what it has been quietly becoming the longer it has held, is something for you. A return to yourself, a reclamation of the energy that was perpetually directed outward toward someone who had not demonstrated they deserved to be the primary recipient of all that you carry, a reminder of who you are when you are not performing yourself for an audience of one who was not fully seeing the performance anyway. That is what the silence gave you, not power over them, though that is real and it is present. Power over yourself. Power that lives inside you and does not depend on their response or their recognition or their eventual realization of what they let go of. You stopped talking, and in the quiet, you remembered who you were before they became the thing you were always trying to explain yourself to. You remembered, and that remembering is worth more than anything their reaction to your silence could ever give you. Hold it, protect it, and do not give it back for anything less than someone who never required you to explain yourself in the first place. That is what you deserve, and now you know it too.